Okay, so today we're going to talk about the torso. And the torso is one of the most important things to get within a pose. It really is the key information about what's happening in the pose. You can get a good sense of the gesture of the entire pose with just getting an accurate gesture of the torso. And when I'm talking about a torso, I'm really thinking about the ribcage, and the pelvis and their relationship to each other. So something that I like to do actually just to practice, it's a nice way of doodling, is just doing some ribcage pelvises from my imagination. So this has a lot to do with what we were talking about with the bean, and getting a sense of gesture that way. So if you think about the ribcage here, this way, and then maybe the pelvis is coming forward like this. So even with just the bean like it is here, we can get a sense of an entire pose this way. But when I'm thinking about the ribcage pelvis, like here, I am thinking about basically this being kind of relationship that we have. So I'm putting in the pit of the neck, the belly button, and then you can start to pull out the landmarks from there. Right, bottom of the rib, here within the pelvis. So all of this is just out of my head, but it has a lot to do with drawing a lot of the bean shape and drawing a lot of the boxes. So the boxes is basically the bean kind of more realized within three-dimensional space. Right, so having an understanding of how this bean shape in any form, say it's like this, can then become more of a box if you can start to see the volumes within this. So, thinking about our boxes and our beans are the stepping stone, one of the first things you were thinking about within the torso, within the ribcage pelvis relationships. If we're looking at a figure in an anatomical position, this is our basic front-on view of our ribcage pelvis relationship. And again, going back to our landmarks, we can start to break this down further, right? So the ASIS right here, pit of the neck, into the sternum, bottom of the ribs. You can start to find those points and break this down even further. However, an important thing to note, especially with the ribcage pelvis, is from a side view of this, you know, and if this was a box, it would be very similar. Change too much here. Actually, the box might be kind of helpful in this case. So when we're drawing the ribcage pelvis in this box form, you can really start to see the how it sits in space, right? So this is telling us that this bottom plane, or the ribs are tipping towards us at the bottom. They're closer to us down here than they are up here because we can see this bottom plane of the box. And in terms of the pelvis, it's tipping forward. So this is kind of our closest corner of the pelvis. So keeping in mind those things that are closest and furthest away. Now if we bring this over here, another important thing to note is that this is a little extreme. Is that from a profile, these things are tipped. And then think about our head here. That's tipped also. So these are all things I'm considering when I'm thinking about the ribcage pelvis, right? Thinking about the spine here, going into the sacrum. There's this curve this way, there's a curve this way. And then back up into the back of the head. So again, going back to these basic building blocks, I like to use the bean. The bean really helps you form a gesture of some kind. But from there, thinking about what's happening within the bean in 3 dimensions is an important thing to keep in mind. Okay, now along with those basic, you know, shapes here. So we have to keep this in mind, but then from there, there's a few real basic things that I look for to give you a sense of the gesture of the torso really quickly, and that is a couple landmarks that includes the jugular notch and kind of the shoulder line or the clavicle line. And then the ASIS, which is this tilt. So basically the tilt of the shoulders in relation to the tilt of the hips. And the shoulder tilt can be complicated because our shoulder girdle is actually separate from our rib cage. So you can have a rib cage tilt that goes this way and a shoulder tilt that goes this way. So it's really kind of trying to find the tilt of the rib cage itself and not getting too tricked by the tilt of the shoulders. So we're looking for the tilt of the hips to the tilt of our rib cage. Right, so if these were in a box, we'd be looking for this angle to this angle. Finding these is a really good starting place for any sort of torso development. They're the key points. They really indicate what's happening with the pelvis and what's happening with the rib cage. You can also find that tilt by using the bottom of the ribs here, that landmark. That will help you find that also if the shoulders are not really relating to the tilt of the rib cage. And then the last thing that I'm thinking about here is once you have your tilt here, so this is my tilt of the top part of my rib cage going this way, tilt of my hips going this way. Put those in the box if we wanted to. Now again, these tilts here, these are just rectangles. They're not cubes. They're in no way 3 dimensions. So it's hard to tell if perhaps this is coming forward and this is really tipped backwards. How much of the side plane, right? So all those things we're going to start to develop, but you can also just approach this very two-dimensionally. So coming back here. So the main things I look for to really get me started on developing the torso is the tilt of the rib cage with the tilt of the hips. And that I find with the ASIS. And either the kind of shoulder line, the clavicle with the pit of the neck, or you can use the bottom ribs. But from that point, the next thing I want to find is this outside kind of angle change that links the two things together. Right, so this being a compressed side and this being more of a stretched side of the rib cage. Those are the next big components that I look for, that part that kind of ties it up together so it's almost like one shape. Now once you have this shape, this overall shape, you can start to add whatever you need to based on anatomy or just observational drawing, but you need to really have all of this relating. So this width needs to be accurate from here to here, here to here, down here, but also these angles need to really be accurate because these are the points, these angle changes that are happening here, here, and here are really expressing all of the pelvis and the rib cage. And then of course I'm still thinking about a center line coming through this. And from there you can start to add more anchor points and more landmarks. So we can add, the angle from the nipples, whatever that might be. We can find the belly button, and we can triangulate some of these things from our anchor points within the perimeter. Okay, so let's get started on this torso. This one is a pretty classic, not a whole lot of shifting and twisting and leaning is happening here, but there is a few slight things going on. So when I'm looking at any sort of pose, some of the first things I'm thinking of are, what are the tilts, again, of the hips, the ASIS, to the upper, to the rib cage, and it's pretty slight. I'm not even gonna really, I'm not gonna lock in this tilt right away, but I can see it a lot clearer in the hips here. It's a slight tilt. From there, like I said, I'm going to identify if there is one side with a big angle change and if there's one side without. So basically a compressed side and a non-compressed side. He's, for the most part, standing upright, but he is in like a 3/4 view, so we actually see a lot more of the back muscles on his left side. So again, this is very much, at first, very two-dimensional. Just getting a sense of these tilts and this angle change from one side of the torso to the other side. Now from there, I'm going to think about the twist. So if there is a twist between the rib cage and the pelvis, and I am seeing slightly that there is, that the hips are, if I were to over-exaggerate this, by doing a little box conception up here in the corner. Hips are, we see a lot more of the side plane of the hips, and it seems like his torso is actually rotating a little bit more towards us. Something along these lines. So there is a slight twisting of the pelvis this way, or twisting of this that way. Now, sometimes I like to do that. I like to have a little kind of mock-up of what the actual boxes of the ribcage and pelvis are doing up in the corner, just a little one to help remind me of those things that are happening. That being said, what's going to happen there is we're going to see, if we track down the center line here, there's going to be a little switch in the center line. It's not going to just be this straight, clean, smooth line. There is, because there's a twist, the center line is going to twist a little bit also. So within the kind of placing the center line, I want to think about if I'm seeing more of the left side or more of the right side. I'm seeing more of the left side here, which this is indicating that as well, right? We see side planes of this to here is a lot wider than this to there. Now our torso, it's going to extend out, you know, it's nice to get a sense of the arms and the legs within a torso, but it's not crucial. So I'm just gonna think about the angles of his arms. just indicated with some really loose lines here. The lines that I'm looking for are just where his elbow kind of switches in relation to the torso. Okay, and then I'm going to come in here again and start to refine some spots. So I'm going to lay in actual landmarks now. Let's call this the pit of the neck. And I'm going to follow that down. These are all just notes. But you can start to triangulate these things. I will say that my approach to drawing is much more shape-based and triangulation-based than constructive anatomy and three-dimensional inserting muscles and that sort of thing. I'm looking for the visual information from my reference. I put down my 2D information, and then I can expand on that with more a 3D lens with more constructive anatomy information. But my first steps, I just want to make sure all the proportions are there. And once it starts reading from that lens, then I start to put muscle information on top of that. But you'd be surprised how far you can get with figure drawing with just point triangulation. Now it's not ideal to just be doing point triangulation. There are weaknesses to it, but you can get pretty far without being an expert of anatomy, and I do not claim to be an expert of anatomy at all. Most of what I'm doing is point triangulation based and two-dimensional. Okay, I'm kind of looking for, this is the top part of there's a line right here that kind of creates this little circle around the pec muscles in his case. And this line is indicating up here the separation from the deltoid and the pec muscles. Looking for this bottom rib line here, and you'll note that as you see me developing this drawing, I'm not stuck to any of my preliminary marks. You know, a lot of the times what'll happen is either this, where I make that tilt of the hips in relation to the tilt of the shoulders, or the top plane of the rib cage here, where I make those lines isn't necessarily correct from top to bottom in that relation. What is important though is that this angle is reading correctly and this angle is reading correctly. So what you'll probably see that's going to happen in this drawing is this tilt is still there, but where it actually ties to the ASIS is probably going to come up a little bit. So I'm not worried about that, and I'm not tied to this line. If I make that my hips, and if I stick to that, then everything's going to be elongated, right? So it's good to have these light line work in the beginning. Everything you put down is just a note for yourself in the future. It's just information, so you don't have to stick to it. pit of the neck is lining up with this angle change here. This angle change is really talking about where the lats in the back are being obscured by our oblique muscle here. So every angle change obviously means something about the anatomy of what's happening. And there's always overlapping forms. Okay, so let's find kind of where the arms overlap with the torso in terms of just a two-dimensional point. Okay, that works. We can use this negative space. Now again, I'm not really worried about developing the arms too much, but I will use the negative space to make sure things are heading in the right direction. So some of those initial marks that I made, just to get me in the ballpark, are off, right? That's okay. Thinking about the clavicles here. Do the same thing on the other side. Now let's just kind of over-exaggerating this form right now to try to find its abs. Okay, let's find this ASIS now officially. Okay, there on this side, as it cuts across, angle is feeling good, but it's way on the other side here. You can cross-reference that if you want. Okay, as you see, I'm starting to develop a little bit darker line work now. Once I'm getting a little more confident with where things are at. Okay, torsos look crazy without at least a hint of going on with the head. I mean, you don't have to do this, but it is kind of like helps keep the momentum going. Otherwise, you start to wonder what the heck you're drawing. So just to get a sense. those outside lines is helpful. Okay, let's jump back in here. I like to do that every now and then, whether it's with the head or anywhere where it's like I'm kind of working within the torso right now. But you want to try to keep your eyes fresh as possible, so it's nice to jump somewhere that's a little bit less developed, a little bit more big picture stuff. Kind of switches the way you think, and then you start working over here, and then you can come back and you'll have fresher eyes. You'll be able to work a little bit longer that way. You'll get less frustrated. If you start working, keep developing a drawing, and your eyes are starting to get weak, or your mental concentration is starting to get weak, you'll make a lot of mistakes. One thing to keep an eye out for too is if you start getting really dark lines happening, that typically means you're searching for the line. You don't know where it is. So if you start to make really dark line work, I would just step back and go somewhere else, because it's a good sign that you're not quite sure what's happening. You have to regroup and come back to it. Okay, let's try to throw in some shadow information here. Shadow, core shadow line here. If you think about, our sphere, this pec muscle has a really round quality to it, so you can find a similar kind of cast shadow. To what's happening here. Now, I'm not going to go in here and map out all these little nuances within the rib cage and the serratus. There's a lot of small little things happening. I'm just going to go through some of this big picture stuff. That's not quite a straight line though. Same thing here, you can see a very similar shadow shape happening, which helps you understand what's happening on the light side too. Alright, we have to get down here into the pubic bone. Make sure that's placed. This will help me get a good sense of the width of the thigh here. Again, to get correct information within the torso, you really have to extend out a little bit into the shoulder girdle and a little bit down into the legs, because everything has to line up. Okay, let's drop in a value here. A little bit. And I'm gonna just go from here and develop this further. Really solidify the marks that I've made. try to relate everything across the form. So when you're trying to find, you know, any sort of information, like say for instance this kind of side of the ribs here under the pec, come back to this side and find that, see how that relates across the form. So if you're doing the pecs over here, start thinking about the pecs on the other side, just to make sure it's all working. Bring this up a little bit. Okay, now we have a different reference image up, and I'm gonna try to do this. I'm gonna show you guys what I can get in a 5-minute pose. I'm gonna set a little timer here. I'm gonna try to talk through this still. Okay, so here we go, 5 minutes. First thing, like every time, is I'm looking for the tilt of the shoulders or the rib cage here against the tilt of the pelvis. So those are going to be my first two that I put in. This isn't 100% accurate, but it is giving a sense of the gesture of the rib cage pelvis relationship. Now within this, the next thing is going to be finding, I'm going to go a little bit more gestural this time. So there's a compressed side and a not compressed side in this version too. Okay, and it's roughly in there. However, this is, if this is all you can get done in 5 minutes, then that's totally fine, you know. Or just what we want is an accuracy of these tilts and also from this side to this side. So I'm seeing that I don't have that quite right. So I'm going to bring this in a little bit. This feels pretty close though. Now adding in the next couple stages here. So within this, right, I'm thinking of this rib cage being like this, pelvis being kind of this way, and let's look for center line here. And there is a slight S curve to the center line that we have. Now I'm gonna just break this down even further, and I'm gonna find the angle of the nipples here. Okay, so with that kind of all boxed in really broadly, now I'm going to add in some more detail here. And with 5 minutes, you know, I'm not sure how far I can get into this, but let's make sure that this angle change feels right. Get a sense of this arm. That's not quite right. And then I'm also going to try to get a sense of like the bottom of the breasts here, because the nipples, they're good landmarks, but they're not structural landmarks. belly button. Alright, let's do this side. There is more of a, this comes in more than I have it. Okay, let's go down and find the pubic symphysis here. Alright. So that's 5 minutes. You know, I didn't get anywhere into shadow shapes or anything like that, but I am getting these tilts, this basic tilt of the ribcage pelvis, this distance starting to get more accurate, the width here of the torso, and then coming down and finding more landmarks. I just found the ASIS and I was trying to pull that across. So yeah, that's a 5. Alright, we're gonna do a 10-minute now, different pose. Let's set the timer. Alright, we're going. Alright, so same idea here. This time I'm just gonna get this kind of gestural arc in here. This is a back view. There's still this big kind of wedge shape that we can find. So just getting the tilts once again from the back. What we have to use to find this tilt is actually the sacrum. There's a kind of this little triangle with the dimples. These dimples are like our hip, and then this triangle is our sacrum, our tailbone. So finding that, we can find this central curve, and there is an S curve happening here. Finding the basic kind of, in this case, since he's sitting on the ground, it's nice to have this ground plane sorted out. And then looking at this width, I'm going to start to So right here I'm drawing through the shoulder and the lat. The lat muscle is kind of doing this, but I'm trying to really feel this rib cage within that. Just to get a sense of what's happening with the leg. With compressed poses like this, there's a lot more like two-dimensional information you can get down really quick since there's a lot of overlapping form, and it's only going to help inform the torso in this case, you know, where this leg interacts with the arm here. It's useful information, so you might as well develop it all. The the same time. Okay, now with something like this where there's not a lot of strong muscle definition happening, I think it's important to try to find shadow shapes. You can put them in. There's no like right or wrong time to put a shadow shape in. It's just shadow shapes help inform. They just give more context. So if you're struggling with one part and you're like, for instance, you're struggling with trying to figure out the overall width here, something you can do is start to break it into smaller chunks with the shadow shapes. I'm going to just preemptively already mask this shadow in. Okay. So let's look at this again. Good. So unfortunately, sometimes when you're focusing on the torso, you really have to draw everything around the torso to get a sense of what it's actually doing. Trapezius. With this particular reference, the shadow information is really flattened out. Like, I'm not seeing a lot of definition in here. I know that our trapezius is here, but sometimes less is more. Like I've mentioned before, I really focus on the two-dimensional aspects of things first, and then I inform that with more of the anatomy, more of the 3D stuff. So I'm not really worrying about that until I have my proportions right. There's not really any point of informing, putting all this muscular information, all this anatomy inside of something that is misproportioned. we're starting to feel the shoulder blade here. Inside, not so much. But we are seeing a little bit of definition. Oh. Alright, so that's a 10-minute, very gestural still. But yeah, again, I was going for this big information first, right? This became one big shadow shape, this one big light shape, a little bit of our landmarks here, but for the most part, I was finding this tilt here, I was trying to find this tilt down here, and I was thinking about the three-dimensionality, the twist that's happening here. This whole thing is going around. Right? This is pretty much just sitting flat. There's not a lot of dynamic motion happening with the hips, but the torso is leveraging off of, or the rib cage is leveraging off of the pelvis, twisting around. All of this doesn't feel quite right, but 10 minutes. Alright, this one's going to be a 20, and it's going to be, this pose is a lot different. There's a lot of foreshortening happening and twisting and turning. When I have poses like this, I really focus more on the 2D shapes first, and I do that anyway, but for poses that are like really foreshortened, it's nice to just think about shapes and overlapping shapes. Don't get too caught up in the fact that things are moving away from us in space. Just break it down into shape information. Now the thing with something like this is I am not going to look at the same, I'm not going to approach the torso the same way in this case. There's a lot of different things happening. So shapes first in this case. Not thinking about the tilt of the hips to the rib cage. It's just this pose is a lot more unique. Center line of the rib cage here. This is the jugular notch. Thinking about the three-dimensional nature of this rib cage here, just to help pinpoint some. I'm looking for the nipples right now. Right, this pose is really extreme. You can see him starting to develop. You might start to be able to see the head here. It's going to go off the page. Finding triangles wherever I can, so we can see the left side of the bony landmark of the hip, the ASIS here, and we can't see the other side. So a lot of the times, some of our anatomy stuff that we know fails us in certain poses, and I think that's why I lean so heavily on this 2D approach of just, here's the ASIS, you can't find the other side. However, where this two-dimensionally lines up with this part of the thigh and this part of the thigh, that's information I can look at. Now, shadow shapes, we can try to hit a couple of these. Shadow information gets pretty soft around here. Okay, I'm going to come back over here and see if I can develop a little bit further. So this is an important part, is now I'm starting to really flesh out the three-dimensionality. Within this, there's a couple of really small overlaps that are happening that I think are important. Still a nice bony landmark here. See how I'm jumping around? Now, I will oftentimes develop a drawing from a central spot outward, but it's good to like stop yourself somewhere, jump somewhere else, work that area a little bit. I'm also very much like triangulating. I'm drawing through my form, through the points. So this area, I'm not working the arm, it definitely needs adjusting based on where I'm trying to place the rest of these marks. Trapezius here. Arm deltoid, you can feel the deltoid here, bicep here. I think the torso is a really nice place. I know I've talked to you guys about triangulating like this. And that totally is, I think, the best way to start approaching drawing, especially observational comparative drawing. However, once you understand, the reasons, how to triangulate and when to triangulate, you can actually triangulate from within outward. So you saw that I started with some basic lines that I was triangulating and spreading them outward instead of starting big and working inward. So you can work both ways. Alright, let's do one more example. This one is going to be another 20-ish minutes. Okay, again, finding tilt of rib cage. To the tilt and relation to the pelvis. From there, let's draw this gestural sweep of the stretched side, and then try to find the compressed side. Just to give me some sense of understanding the weight of the pose, I am going to put in here just the ground plane where the hips and legs interact, and then the same with where the hand. And I have like a little gesture of an arm here. Get a sense of where that arm is. Okay, so let's start with this. So again, within triangulating, this is indicating the right side of the rib cage. But if you follow that line and that angle all the way through, it's a pretty good spot for where the hip hits the ground plane here. And you'll actually start to notice that a lot within figure drawing, is a lot of things line up together. And the more you can actually universally relate things, as in like the side plane here relating to this hip interaction here, the more unified and solid your drawings are going to feel. Okay, so let's look for again, I'm moving that line up. That doesn't necessarily, that angle is to represent the ASIS, but it's not necessarily in the right spot within this shape. It's just that angle that we want, really. Let's find, let's actually use this angle change as a key component here. I'm going to really take my time with this, just to make sure everything is correlating. down and find the pubic bone. Roughly there. Ground plane down a little bit. So everything I'm doing is just big picture, proportional things, decisions. Belly button. Find that center line and what kind of curves are happening. Alright, next point is going to be to the bottom of the breast. From here I'm going to triangulate that. Okay, things are feeling pretty good in the ballpark here. So I want to add this arm, maybe the top of the shoulder, maybe a little reference to the head, and then start placing shadow shapes. angular notch.
Okay. So this feels pretty good for overall proportions. Now I pushed it back, and now I'm going to start mapping out shadow shapes based on those landmarks that I've found. And I'll also refine some of the shapes a little bit. You can triangulate some of the points within the shadow shapes as well, or you can just start to feel the volumes. that shadow shape in real fast. Alright, that was my 20-minute timer. I'm just going to push this a little bit further. Finish massing in the shadow shape. And then we'll call it. So I wouldn't get too, when you guys are doing these exercises, don't get too attached to any drawing that you have. You might feel like one's coming along really nicely, and so you want to just keep working on it and keep pushing it. But it's really important to follow the timer. If if we were in the model room in real life, we'd have a timer, the model would need a break, you'd be forced to stop and get a new pose going. So try to replicate that working from home, if you're working from home. Push this back. Alright, and just to illustrate for the camera here, I'm going to just sharpen up some of these edges. Okay, so that's around a 20. You can see the less developed kind of gestural quality to the shoulder girdle and the arms and the head.